Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Koenig, and this is Chapter 9 of Assessment and Evaluation. And this chapter is about selecting, administering, scoring, and interpreting our assessment results. So, selecting assessment instruments and strategies, first of all, we need to know what type of information is needed, um, what information is already available to us, how we're going to get the information we need, if we need to search assessment resources because we might not have the assessment that is going to get the information for us that we need, and then whether we need to evaluate and select an assessment instrument or a strategy. We probably need a strategy even if we already have the instrument. So we're going to identify the type of information needed. As we're looking at what's needed, keep in mind that it's always up to the counselor to determine what we need, how we're going to collect it, and what the purpose of the assessment is. And the purpose of the assessment actually might be something that is given to us if we are seeing someone that is a court mandated referral. There's probably some assessment questions that's coming along with that, and the purpose of the assessment is to make a determination for the court or for another entity. So keep that in mind as well. So we do want to identify what's available to us. We probably want to have a conversation with the client, with the referral source, if there is one, with parents, if there are parents, the foster system, whoever. We can do that with an intake questionnaire so that we can identify where the person's been seen before, what their historical data is. We may come up with a preliminary diagnosis because they may have been diagnosed by 3 or 4 other people in the past, and we want to know what those diagnoses are if possible. We want to look at their grades in school. If they've had any previous assessments, whether that's school-based or whether it's from another agency, and then if there's any anecdotal records. So we're going to figure out how we want to obtain the information, and that can be a combination of formal and informal strategies. It might be observations, interview tests, whatever is best suited to the client that we've got and the setting that that client is in or that we will have them in. We also want to make sure that whatever methods we choose, that we are qualified and competent to administer and interpret. So some additional places to look for assessment resources. We have like reference materials, the Middle Measurement Yearbook. I know that you guys are probably all very familiar with that by this point. Tests in print, etc. The test publisher catalogs. I think the test publisher catalogs are a great resource. We do need to understand that test publishers are in the business of publishing tests and making money. So there is a possibility they can be biased. You want to just sort of take that under advisement as you're reading through some of the testing assessments that are available. So these are things that normally are on the publisher's website. And I put this in as a live link just so that you can sort of see what's available through PAR, which is Psychological Assessment Resources. Let's go up here to products. I think this is by category. And this will give you some idea if you're looking for maybe a measure of ADHD or someone who's possibly on the spectrum, anxiety, depression. You see some forensic evaluations here. Some of these things you might look at and think, well, that's not within the scope of my practice. And if it's not within the scope of your practice, then you're probably not going to be administering that. Some of these things may not be within the scope of your practice now, but with supervision and practice, they could be within your scope of practice because at the master's level, you may be qualified to give them. You just need someone to work with you as you give them the first, second, third time until you are comfortable with that. So keep that in mind. I want to flip back over here. Actually, let's look at Pearson assessments. Pearson has a lot more assessments. This is available, I think, in alphabetical order, the way that this is laid out. So you can see there's a lot of assessments here. I'm going to go down to the bottom because it has the categories here. So if you're looking for something academic, behavioral, personality, a lot of these things would be things that at the master's level you would be able to gain competency in. Okay, so less, that's given you a lot to sort of, I think, look at. So I'm going to go on to the next slide, and you can look at those resources at your leisure. So a test manual is going to be a great source of information if you are selecting a test. However, unless it's a test that your agency has purchased, you're probably not going to get access to that test manual unless you purchase the manual. And that can sometimes be cost prohibitive. So I talk about that a little bit in the next slide. Just keep that in mind. Academic journals are another really good way to find instruments that may be suitable for the population that you're serving or what it is that you need to test for. Um, if you're doing a program, a few years ago, I did a program that was for college students, and it was on at-risk drinking. And at the time, Rutgers had came up with an instrument that I was able to use I found it because it was published in a journal, the psychometric properties were. And that author note basically said, if you want to use this, this is the person to contact. And it was the author and I guess the group that had published that instrument and the article talking about that instrument. So I contacted them. They were professors at Rutgers University and basically said, yeah, you can use the instrument. There's no charge for it. Here's a copy of it. And here's the letter basically saying that it's not, that you have our permission to use it. So that can be a great way to get copies of instruments to use. I've actually done that several different times. I think that was the first time that I was ever able to do that and used it for a 3-year long program. So don't count those out. You may just have to jump through some hoops to get the instrument. There are also ways to locate tests online through Burroughs or the Educational Testing Service or the ERIC Clearinghouse. So make sure that you're checking those out. If you are in need of an assessment that your agency doesn't have or you do not have. And then there's also a directory of unpublished experimental measures, which if you're doing some research, that might be handy for you. Another way to find instruments is through professional organizations, and this is a really common way to find instruments. Sometimes professional organizations actually are the publishers, and if you are interested in, looking at autism, you might look at some of the professional organizations for autism because they might have some instruments or whatever type of assessment you're looking for. Look for a professional organization aligned with that particular type of assessment. So we want to know what the purpose of an instrument is and who the intended population is before we're going to select it for use. What was the sample population that was used in developing the instrument? What's the psychometric properties? Is it valid? What are the norms for it? We also want to know, how clear is the manual? Is it going to give us detailed instructions about how to administer it? Most things that are published through PAR and through Pearson, I've never gotten anything that didn't have clear instructions. Occasionally, I have gotten something that is through a professional organization as the publisher, and sometimes I guess I recently got an instrument through a professional organization like that, and it left a little bit to be desired as far as clarity when it came to the instructions. But there was someone that I could call and ask questions of, so that was helpful. We want to know, does the manual provide enough information that we have clear directions on how to score it, how to interpret it, and how to report the results. And sometimes, even if there is directions, if it's a very complex test like an IQ test or the MMPI, we still are going to need someone who has expertise in that instrument to help us whenever we first begin using that, scoring it, and interpreting it. And the MMPI is something, the MMPI and intelligence instruments are something that at a master's level you would be doing under the supervision of someone with a doctorate. So there should be someone who you can go to for to answer questions and to gain expertise. So I put this in because I do really want to try to keep it real. Um, I have worked in agencies before where assessment was, maybe it was something that you did whenever you were doing an intake interview with somebody, and you were gonna in the interview look at symptoms of depression and symptoms of anxiety and symptoms of behavior disorders or conduct disorder or whatever it was. Um, but as far as a formalized assessment, the formalized assessment was pretty informal. You weren't pulling out a Beck depression inventory, or you weren't pulling out an ACEs, or you weren't pulling out something else and formally adding that to the interview that you were doing in order to back up the information that you were getting in the clinical interview. So I'm not sure. I haven't worked in community mental health for quite a while. I'm not sure if that still goes on. My sense from doing supervision with students sometimes is that that is still happening quite a bit. So if you're in an agency where there's not a lot of testing as far as using a testing instrument, the kinds of things that we're talking about in class, a lot of that's not happening. But you really are interested in assessment and you want to develop your skills. One of the things that you can do is you can identify what are the gold standard assessments in the area where if you're working with children, then probably an ADHD assessment is going to be something that is needed. It's going to be used all the time. What's the gold standard ADHD assessment? Identify what that is. And then if your agency does not use that, then I would talk to my agency about how that could benefit them. So under number two, identify, what what's in it for the agency, and do a proposal to your supervisor. Hey, I am willing to learn how to give this instrument if you're willing to support me in that. So if the agency is willing to buy the instrument and help you find supervision or pay for the supervision that you need, if you need supervision to do it, then that's going to be good for them. And it's also going to be a way to develop your skills. So I wouldn't start with MMPI, or I wouldn't start with an intelligence test. I would start with something that is going to be meaningful for the population that that agency is dealing with, it wherever you're working. And I would start there. And once you are maybe able to get an ADHD instrument under your belt and you're doing that and you feel comfortable with that, then let's think about what else. Is there another population? Is there something else that we should be assessing for consistently? And then go find an instrument or figure out what the gold standard is if you were going to assess depression, or if you were going to assess an eating disorder, or if you were going to assess whatever else it is that you see walking in the door on a regular basis. So that's one practical way to begin to develop your assessment skills, and hopefully not to have to purchase those instruments for yourself. Okay, so practical issues whenever we're trying to select an instrument or come up with a strategy. We want to make sure that we are considering how much time is required for the person to take the test, and how much time is required for us to score the test and interpret the test. And some of them can be quite like time intensive. How much does it cost? How much does it cost for the manual and all of that, the kit, usually? And then how much is it going to cost for each individual booklet or each individual score sheet that you have to purchase every time an individual takes that test? So you might have not have to buy the kit again, but once you're out of the first, 15 that come with the kit, then is it going to cost, $2 per person or $5 per person or what? What's the format? Is it computer based? Is it paper and pencil based? Is it something that a person can sit down and give to themselves? Is it self administered and then you verify the scoring and interpret it? Is it readable? What grade level is it? How easy is it to administer? How easy is it to score and interpret? So I think this goes without saying, but before you give any instrument, you should know what is on that instrument. If it is a more complex instrument that is standardized, you should be very familiar with giving it. You should have given it at least a couple of times to someone as a practice. So you don't want to be your first practice giving a high level instrument to a person who is going to have maybe some consequences in their life, depending on what the interpretation and the scores on that test say. So you want to make sure you are doing a practice test at least a couple of times with somebody who can guide you. Okay, so during the administration, once you are giving it for real, and if you're doing this for practice, you're going to do the same things because we want practice to be set up exactly like we were giving it to an actual client. So if it is where you're giving out booklets, you're going to be responsible for making sure the environment's good, the people know where the restrooms are, they've got pencils, they're not too hot, they're not too cold, all of those things. The fire alarm's not going off, there's nobody, using the jackhammer outside of the window, those kinds of things. If it's a standardized test, you're going to follow those directions verbatim. You're going to just read those out to the client. Hopefully, you're going to be able to establish a rapport with client. And a lot of times in a standardized test, that's going to come down to body language. So if your body language is approachable and welcoming and warm, that's going to help you in a standardized test to build rapport with a client. Be alert to problems and any behavioral issues that come up during administration. After, you're going to take all the materials back. Make sure you're going to count the booklets if this is a group situation. If you have 30 people taking the test, you should have 30 booklets and you should have 30 answer sheets. You're going to pack your materials according to whatever the manual says to do. If there was a fire alarm that went off, or if somebody got sick and vomited, or because that happens, anything that was unusual that happened during the test, you're going to record that. And then you're going to score out the instrument. If it is computer scored and you just put the sheet through the computer or you send it off to the publisher, it might be scored by the client or you might be scoring it yourself. We're going to make sure, though, that the scores are actually accurate. So if it is a performance-based test, then you're going to have a scoring rubric that you're using to score out the test. I can think of, like, if it's an employment test, I usually use a performance-based test whenever we are hiring at our office, especially for our front desk staff. So scoring errors. The bottom line is don't make them. And an error is just that sometimes we don't know we've made a mistake. So make sure that you are double checking your work, whether it's a transposition error, whether it is a mathematical error. Even if it is computer scored, you do need to be spot checking to make sure that what's coming out of the computer makes sense. And then when it comes to interpreting things, we want to make sure that any standard scores that we are presenting to our client, that we are presenting them in a way that it makes sense to the client. This is where I think graphing and using that standard score, whether it's a percentile or whether it's a percentile, is usually very easy to understand if we're graphing a score. and we can explain to a client where they stand relative to other test takers. Um, let's see. So just know that if we are giving a report, or I'm sorry, if we're giving a test that has a computer generated report, you're still responsible for making sure that that test is scored appropriately and that it is interpreted appropriately. So I would suggest that you go over all of the indices of the test and make sure that that looks like it's an accurate reflection of what you heard or observed during the testing situation if you were present, and if not, that the indices do actually add up to what the overall global score is going to be. What you basically want to do is do some double checks to make sure that before you give this outcome or this interpretation to a client, that the computer has scored something correctly. And I would also say that there's probably things you want to tweak and add to individualize those assessment results for that particular person. We always want to report results accurately. We want to make sure they're understandable for whoever it is that we're giving those results to. Um, let's see. I've already talked about reviewing for accuracy. And that is the end of chapter 9.